I didn't scream when I saw the empty stand. That's the part that still surprises people when I tell this story. They expect shouting or tears or something dramatic. But all I did was stare at the bare patch of carpet in my parents' living room, where my daughter's cello had been resting less than an hour earlier. The case was gone, the instrument was gone, and my mother wouldn't meet my eyes. That should tell you everything. I should probably explain how we got there, but before I do, you need to understand one thing very clearly: that cello was never just an instrument. It wasn't a hobby, it wasn't an accessory, it was my daughter's future, and my parents knew that. They knew exactly what they were doing when they sold it. It started in the middle of a Sunday afternoon with my father holding a glass of iced tea like nothing in the world was wrong. "You're overreacting," he said calmly. "It's already done." "Done?" I asked. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Where is it?" My mother finally spoke, still refusing to look at me. "You shouldn't have left something that valuable here." That was the moment everything changed. Because in that sentence, "you shouldn't have left it here," was the quiet admission I hadn't been ready to hear. They hadn't lost it. They hadn't moved it for safekeeping. They had taken it. The confrontation didn't explode the way you might expect. It curdled. It sank into the room like poison gas. "Tell me you didn't," I said slowly now. My father sighed the way he used to when I disappointed him as a kid. "We did what was practical." "What does that mean?" I asked. He glanced at my mother. She nodded once. "We sold it," he said. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. "Sold what?" "The cello," my mother said quietly, "for $87,000. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was. My hands were shaking. My phone buzzed in my pocket, my daughter texting me from her practice studio, asking when I'd be back so we could run the box suite again. She had no idea her life had just been detonated. That cello wasn't a surprise purchase. It wasn't an inheritance. It was the result of 12 years of discipline, sacrifice, and pain, mostly mine, some of hers. When my daughter Eliza was 6, she fell in love with the cello the first time she heard it live. Not a cartoon version, not a YouTube clip. A real performance, close enough to feel the vibration in her chest. She looked at me afterward and said, "That's what I want to do forever." I believed her. My parents didn't. They laughed it off at first. "Kids change their minds," my mother said. "Don't waste money." But Eliza didn't change her mind. She practiced until her fingers blistered. She turned down parties. She earned scholarships to summer conservatories before she hit her teens. By the time she was 16, she was being quietly scouted. That was when the old German cello entered our lives, a 19th century instrument with a voice so deep and resonant it made people cry without knowing why. We didn't own it outright at first. We leased it through a foundation, then bought it with every dollar I had and several I didn't. My parents knew its value. They knew it was insured. They knew it never left my sight, until the one weekend I trusted them to watch it. Back in the living room, my father stood up, straightening his shirt like he'd just completed a chore. "You left it here," he said again. "We assumed you'd want the money more than a wooden box." "It wasn't yours," I said. "It was in our house," my mother replied. That was the justification. Thin, ugly, final. What I didn't realize at the time was that they hadn't just crossed a line, they'd committed a crime, and they had no idea how much evidence they'd left behind. That reckoning was coming, just not yet. I should probably explain why the cello was in my parents' house in the first place, because if I don't, it sounds like I was careless. I was. 3 weeks before that Sunday, Eliza had been invited to audition for a European youth orchestra, not a summer camp, not a workshop. A fully funded year-long placement that fed directly into conservatories most musicians only dreamed about. Berlin, Vienna, Zurich. The audition required travel, paperwork, and one impossible detail: her primary instrument had to be professionally appraised overseas before final selection. Normally, the cello would have gone straight from our house to a specialist courier. But 2 days before pickup, our apartment building flooded. A pipe burst on the floor above us, and water poured down like rain through the ceiling. The cello survived, but the apartment didn't. We were displaced for a week. Hotels wouldn't allow instruments of that value without special insurance riders. Storage facilities were a risk. I was running out of options. My parents offered. "Leave it with us," my mother said over the phone. "We have space, we're careful." I hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than I knew. They had always resented the cello, not openly, not loudly, but in the way resentment usually lives. Quiet comments, side glances, the constant refrain that I was putting too much pressure on my child. I ignored it because I wanted peace. I always had. So I brought the cello to their house myself. I placed it gently in the corner of their living room. I showed them how to lock the case. I reminded them it was insured, but that insurance didn't make it replaceable. My father nodded, my mother smiled. "Don't worry," she said. "We know how important it is to you." Not to Eliza, to me, that should have warned me. After they told me they sold it, I stood up slowly and asked one question. "Who did you sell it to?" My father hesitated just long enough. "A collector," he said. "Private sale." "Name?" I asked. My mother cut in. "Why does that matter? The transaction is legal." "No," I said, "it's not." They both froze. I pulled out my phone and opened the insurance policy. I scrolled to the clause I'd memorized during the years of ownership. "Unauthorized sale by non-owner constitutes theft," I read aloud. "Reportable to law enforcement." My mother scoffed. "You wouldn't do that to us." I looked at her and realized she meant it. She truly believed blood made her untouchable. That belief was about to cost her everything. I didn't tell Eliza right away. That's the part I regret the most. I told her the appraisal was delayed, that paperwork was slow. I bought time because I thought, stupidly, that maybe I could fix this quietly. That maybe my parents would come to their senses. They didn't. Instead, they transferred the money out of their joint account within 48 hours. They paid off their credit cards, booked a cruise, put a down payment on a new SUV. They spent my daughter's future like it was found money. What I didn't realize at the time was that every one of those transactions created a trail: bank records, sale listings, text messages, and the buyer. He wasn't nearly as anonymous as my father believed. The night I finally told Eliza the truth, she didn't cry. She just sat on her bed, staring at her hands. "Did they know?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Did they care?" she asked. I didn't answer. That silence broke something in her, and in me, because in that moment I understood this wasn't just about theft. It was about punishment. They had always believed I was defying them by raising my daughter differently, by letting her dream bigger than they ever allowed me to. Selling the cello wasn't an accident, it was a correction, and corrections, I would soon learn, come with consequences. What I didn't realize at the time was how carefully they'd planned it, not in the way criminals plan things, but in the way people who think they're right plan things. The way entitlement sharpens into strategy. 2 days after the confrontation, I went back to my parents' house with a printed copy of the police report form. I hadn't filed it yet. I wanted to give them one last chance. My father opened the door like nothing had happened. "We already talked about this," he said. "No," I replied. "You talked, I listened, now it's my turn." I laid the papers on the kitchen table. My mother stared at them like they were a personal insult. "You're really going to do this?" she asked. "After everything we've done for you?" There it was, the debt, the unspoken ledger they'd been keeping my entire life. "You didn't do this for me," I said. "You did it to her." My father's jaw tightened. "That girl needs structure, not fantasies." "She earned that cello," I said. "You stole it." My mother leaned forward. "We converted an asset, that's all." That was the first time I understood something essential. They didn't see Eliza as a person in this story. She was a variable, a bargaining chip. A mistake I was supposed to correct. I told them I would file the report if the cello wasn't returned within 72 hours. My mother laughed. "You won't find it," she said. "And even if you do, it's gone overseas by now." That sentence landed harder than anything else. Because it meant this wasn't impulsive. They'd moved fast, they'd known exactly where to sell it, they'd wanted it gone. I left their house shaking but not helpless. The next morning, I called the foundation we'd purchased the cello through. They still had the original provenance documents. They still had the serial markings recorded, they still had photos. More importantly, they had contacts. By the end of the day, I had a name, not a collector, a dealer. One with a reputation for buying quietly from family disputes and reselling internationally. And he had a website with a listing that made my stomach drop. There it was, my daughter's cello, photographed beautifully, described lovingly, priced higher than what my parents sold it for. I took screenshots of everything: the timestamp, the description, the imperfections only I recognized. What I didn't realize yet was that the dealer had also made a mistake. He'd listed the cello before it cleared export documentation, which meant it was still in the country. When I filed the police report, the officer didn't dismiss me. That surprised me. He asked precise questions, requested documentation, took the insurance clause seriously. "This isn't a civil matter," he said finally. "This is felony theft." I felt something inside me steady for the first time in days. The officer contacted my parents that evening. They called me immediately. "You went too far," my mother hissed over the phone. "You sold stolen property," I replied. "We're your parents. And she's my daughter." There was a pause, then my father said something I will never forget. "She'll get over it." That sentence sealed everything. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The dealer was cooperative the moment law enforcement appeared. He provided transaction records, wire transfer details, signed bills of sale. The signature wasn't mine, it was my mother's, she had forged it. What I didn't realize at the time was how badly that forgery would backfire, because forging a signature on an instrument of that value didn't just mean theft, it meant fraud, and fraud doesn't care who raised you. When Eliza was informed the cello had been located but not yet recovered, she finally cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. She cried like someone mourning something still alive but out of reach. I promised her I would not let this disappear quietly. That promise would cost me my relationship with my parents forever, but it would give my daughter something far more important: justice. The day the police recovered the cello, I wasn't there. I was sitting in my car outside my parents' house, watching two officers walk up their front steps with measured professional calm. No sirens, no shouting, just consequences arriving on time. I had been asked not to interfere. That was harder than I expected. I'd spent my entire life mediating my parents' tempers, softening their words, absorbing their disappointment. Standing back while someone else finally confronted them felt unreal, like watching gravity reverse. My mother opened the door first. I could see her through the windshield, her posture stiffening the moment she recognized the uniforms. My father appeared behind her, already scowling. They didn't see me in the car, that was intentional. I listened as the officers explained why they were there. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. My mother's face collapsed halfway through. My father started talking too fast, gesturing sharply, the way he always did when he thought volume could replace logic. Then one officer held up a folder, my mother reached for it, the officer stepped back. That was when she started crying, not for Eliza, not for what she'd done. For herself. The cello was retrieved from a bonded warehouse on the edge of the city. It was intact, untouched, still in its case. When I opened it later that night in Eliza's room, the familiar scent of old wood and resin filled the air. Eliza ran her fingers along the curve of it like she was checking for a pulse. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm here." I turned away so she wouldn't see me break. What I didn't tell her yet was that recovery didn't mean resolution. The legal process was just beginning. My parents were arrested 2 days later, not dramatically. No handcuffs in the street, but formally, processed, charged, felony theft, forgery, fraud. My father was released on bail the same day. My mother was. That detail split the family in ways I didn't expect. My aunts called me crying, begging me to drop it. My uncle accused me of betrayal. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly had opinions. No one asked how Eliza was doing. That silence was louder than any accusation. My parents' lawyer contacted me through mine. He suggested mediation, restitution, a family resolution. I declined because restitution didn't erase intent, and family, I was learning, didn't mean immunity. What I didn't realize yet was that the court would agree with me. The pretrial hearings revealed more than I was prepared for. Emails between my parents and the dealer discussing urgency, discussing secrecy, discussing how sentimental objections would blow over. Text messages between my mother and a friend bragging about the sale. "We finally put an end to that nonsense," she'd written. Reading those words felt like swallowing glass. But it also gave the prosecutor exactly what they needed: motive. The trial date was set 3 months out. Eliza left for Europe 2 weeks later without the cello. That was the cruelest irony of all. The foundation arranged a temporary instrument for her, adequate but unfamiliar. She adapted because that's who she was, but the separation hurt her more than she let on. What I didn't realize at the time was that my parents assumed the distance would weaken the case. They were wrong. Distance gave us clarity. On the morning of the trial, my mother avoided my eyes. My father stared at me like I was the one on trial. I felt strangely calm, because the truth was no longer mine to defend. It was documented, verified, unavoidable. And when the prosecutor held up the forged signature and asked my mother if she recognized it, the room went silent. "That," he said, "is not justice delayed, that is justice waiting." I didn't expect the courtroom to feel so small. For something that had swallowed our lives for months, the space itself felt almost insultingly ordinary. Wooden benches, beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed softly like they were bored with human drama. My mother sat at the defense table, hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore the same pearl earrings she always put on when she wanted to look respectable. My father sat beside her, jaw locked, eyes forward. He still hadn't looked at me. That suited me fine. The prosecutor opened with facts, dates, numbers, documents. He spoke calmly, methodically, like he was assembling a machine piece by piece. Then he introduced the motive. Control, he said simply. I felt the word land in my chest. He described how my parents had repeatedly dismissed my daughter's career, how they framed the cello as excess, how they believed selling it was an act of correction, not theft. They believed, he said, turning slightly toward the jury, that they knew better. The defense objected. The judge overruled. What I didn't realize until that moment was how naked my parents were without their authority. In that room, they weren't parents, they weren't elders, they were defendants, and they hated it. When I was called to testify, my legs felt steady, my voice did not. I told the truth, all of it. I talked about Eliza at 6, sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching a cellist like she'd found a missing language. I talked about scraped knuckles and early mornings and the way music gave her a place in the world when nothing else did. Then I talked about trust. I left the cello with them because they're my parents, I said. I thought that meant something. The prosecutor asked me if I had given permission to sell the instrument. No. If I had signed any documents authorizing transfer. No. If my parents knew the cello belonged to my daughter. Yes. The defense didn't cross-examine me for long. They didn't need to. The evidence had already done the damage. My mother testified next. She cried, carefully, strategically. She talked about concern, about pressure, about fear that Eliza's life would be too hard. She said she believed she was helping. Then the prosecutor showed her the text messages, the bragging, the contempt, the certainty. Her voice faltered. Do you recognize this message? He asked. Yes, she whispered. Did you send it? Yes, and when you wrote, we finally put an end to that nonsense. What did you mean? Silence stretched. She didn't answer. That silence spoke louder than any explanation. My father never testified. His lawyer advised against it. I knew why, because my father's weakness was his certainty. And certainty doesn't survive cross-examination. The verdict came faster than I expected, guilty on all counts. My mother sobbed openly. My father went very still, like something inside him had shut down to survive. The judge ordered restitution, full amount plus damages plus court costs. Then came sentencing, probation, community service, mandatory counseling, a suspended sentence contingent on compliance, no prison. Some people later told me that was too light. They were wrong because what followed was far worse for them. The money ran out fast, restitution drained their savings, legal fees swallowed the rest. The cruise was canceled. The SUV sold back at a loss. Their reputation, so carefully curated for decades, collapsed overnight. Church friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact, family gatherings became awkward, then non-existent. They had built their identity on moral authority. The court stripped it away in one afternoon. Eliza returned home 6 months later. Stronger, sharper, changed. The foundation helped us repurchase the cello at a reduced cost after the dealer forfeited his claim. When Eliza played it again for the first time, the sound filled our living room like a homecoming. She didn't ask about her grandparents. I didn't offer. Some silences are earned. A year later, my mother wrote me a letter, not an apology, an explanation. I didn't respond, because explanations don't undo harm, and some bridges burn not because of anger, but because rebuilding them would cost too much. That was the final lesson my parents taught me. And this time, I didn't argue. Time didn't heal what my parents did. It clarified it. That was the uncomfortable truth I kept running into as months passed. People love to say wounds close, that distance softens edges. But some things don't ache less with time, they just become easier to name. The first time Eliza performed publicly after everything, I sat in the third row of a small concert hall with my hands folded so tightly they hurt. She walked out alone, no orchestra, no conductor. Just her and the cello. The opening note trembled not from nerves but from restraint, like she was holding something back. Then halfway through the first movement she let go. The sound was raw, unforgiving, furious. I realized then that she wasn't playing despite what happened. She was playing because of it. That was when I understood something else. My parents hadn't just tried to control her future. They tried to erase her voice, and they had failed. The consequences for them kept unfolding quietly. Probation meant oversight, counseling meant exposure. For the first time in their lives, they were required to listen instead of instruct. They hated it. My father tried to call once, left a voicemail that started with my name and ended in silence. No apology, no request. Just the sound of him breathing, like he expected me to fill in the rest. I didn't call back. My mother stopped writing after her second letter was returned unopened. The family learned to stop asking. What I didn't expect was how much lighter our lives became without them. No criticism masked as concern, no conditional love, no constant sense of being evaluated. Eliza bloomed in that absence. She chose her conservatory, she negotiated her schedule, She failed at one audition and recovered without spiraling. One night, months later, she looked up from her music stand and said, "They were scared, weren't they?" "Yes," I said. "Of what?" "Of not being needed." She nodded like that answer completed a pattern she'd been tracing for years. The final legal matter concluded quietly. The dealer accepted a permanent ban from certain exchanges. The foundation updated their safeguards. A precedent was set. My parents became a cautionary footnote in a system that protects young artists from exactly this kind of exploitation. I took no pleasure in that, but I didn't reject it either. Justice doesn't require joy, only balance. The last time I saw my parents was at a distance. A grocery store parking lot, coincidental, unavoidable. My mother looked older, smaller. My father avoided my gaze. They didn't approach me, they didn't wave. That was new and telling. I got into my car and drove away without looking back. For the first time, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like alignment. People sometimes ask if I regret involving the law, if I regret choosing my daughter over my parents. I always answer the same way. I didn't choose between them, they made the choice for me. When they decided control mattered more than love. When they decided entitlement outweighed consent. When they decided my daughter's future was theirs to sell. Eliza's cello sits in its stand by the window now, not locked away, not hidden. Visible because fear no longer dictates how we live. Every time she plays, the sound carries something extra, something earned, not revenge, not bitterness, but clarity, and that I've learned is the most permanent form of justice there is. After that concert, life settled into a strange rhythm, quiet, focused, and purposeful. Eliza's progress was staggering. Each day she practiced, it was as if she poured the weight of what had been stolen from her into the strings. Her cello didn't just sing, it shouted, demanded, and sometimes wept. And somehow, through it all, I realized that the real theft wasn't the money, it was the time they had tried to steal from her, the years they'd tried to shape before she could even decide. I began documenting everything. Every lesson, every audition, every public performance. Not for revenge, but for accountability. For proof that she had never needed them to succeed, that her talent, her dedication, her passion were hers alone. Friends started noticing a shift in me too. I wasn't the same parent who had been wrapped in fear and anger. The confrontation with my parents had changed something in me. I wasn't bitter anymore. I wasn't plotting. I was calculating, careful, protective, strategic. I learned the hard way that people who betray you rarely learn from guilt alone. You have to shield what matters yourself. One afternoon, the past found us again in a completely unexpected way. A journalist reached out. She had caught wind of the story from the local conservatory newsletter, Eliza's name, her exceptional talent, and the incident with my parents. She wanted to do a feature, a human interest piece with dramatic tension. She framed it carefully, a stolen cello, a betrayal within the family, and the rise of a prodigy. I hesitated. Public exposure meant revisiting everything, the humiliation, the anger, the hurt. But I also realized it was a chance to control the narrative. To show that exploitation doesn't pay, that entitlement can be stopped, and that a child's voice can never truly be silenced by greed. We agreed. The interview was scheduled. Eliza sat across from the reporter, poised and calm, and for the first time I saw her not just as my daughter but as a young woman who had fully reclaimed her life. The article went viral. Not in the sensational clickbait sense, but in the sense that people were shocked and moved by the story. Comments flooded in, warnings to parents, admiration for Eliza's resilience, outrage at the audacity of my parents' theft, and in all of it I felt something I hadn't felt in months: validation. Not revenge validation, not smug satisfaction, but a strange, pure acknowledgement that justice had been restored, that we had survived the betrayal and emerged whole. Yet even as the public recognized our story, my parents remained silent. The letters I had ignored, the calls I hadn't returned, they never escalated, never apologized, never tried to repair anything. They simply existed on the margins of a life they had once tried to dominate. And perhaps that was punishment enough, the realization that their choices had permanently removed them from any meaningful role in the lives they had claimed to love. By now, our home had transformed. The cello corner had become a sanctuary. Each day I watched Eliza grow, practicing relentlessly, performing in small recitals, entering competitions, and slowly building her reputation. Every note she played carried a story, not just of music, but of defiance, resilience, and triumph over betrayal. I often think about that first moment, the one when I realized my parents had sold her cello. The anger, the disbelief, the crushing sense of violation, and then I remind myself it wasn't the cello that defined her, it was the spirit she poured into it afterward. evenings became quieter. Eliza sometimes played alone in the living room, the sun casting long shadows across the walls. And I realized, watching her, that the silence of my parents' absence had become a kind of music in itself. Because we had created our own harmony, built from justice, from careful protection, from hard-earned freedom. By this point, the tension with my parents had faded into a strange background hum, not gone, but distant enough that it didn't dominate every thought. Yet life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. One evening, a letter arrived in the mail, no return address. The envelope was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of old leather. My heart skipped. For a moment, I imagined some form of reconciliation, maybe an apology. Maybe an explanation that would make sense of their madness. I tore it open. Inside was a simple note typed on plain paper. "You got lucky. That cello wasn't meant for you. You had no right. Don't think this is over." No signature, no name. Just a reminder that even in their absence, they still sought control. Rage surged through me, sharper and colder than ever. My hands shook. I crumpled the note, then smoothed it out, thinking, this isn't about me. This is about fear, and fear doesn't get to win. The next morning, I called Eliza into my office. I showed her the letter. She didn't cry, she didn't panic, she simply listened, nodding slowly. "That's them," she said. Her voice was steady, calm, startlingly mature for a 15-year-old. "They'll never stop, will they?" "No," I admitted. "Not completely. But that doesn't matter anymore. We're not letting them control our lives." Her fingers brushed her cello as she spoke. "Then let's make sure they can't touch what matters ever again." And so we fortified everything, legally, emotionally, practically. I hired a lawyer who specialized in family disputes and asset protection. We went over every document, every registration, every proof of ownership we had. My parents had thought they could slip past the law, but I discovered something they hadn't counted on: meticulous record-keeping. Every lesson payment, every concert registration, every donation received, all documented. The lawyer assured me, "You have everything needed to reclaim the full value of that cello, and more importantly, you can secure her future. They can't touch it." A wave of relief washed over me, but also an odd satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, was no longer a vague concept, it was tangible. The following weeks became a strategic game. My parents tried subtle manipulations, calls from unknown numbers, mutual friends asking loaded questions, even small attempts at social sabotage. But we were ready. Every move they made was anticipated, countered, and neutralized. Meanwhile, Eliza's focus never wavered. Each practice session became almost ritualistic, a daily reinforcement of her right to exist, to succeed, to thrive. Her music was no longer just skill, it was power, defiance, and proof that nothing they took could ever break her spirit. Then came the turning point, the auction house where they had sold the cello. I had subpoenaed records and obtained evidence proving that the instrument had been misappropriated. The legal case was airtight, and when my lawyer called to inform me that we had successfully frozen the transaction and reclaimed the $87,000, I felt an odd mix of vindication and relief. I didn't celebrate with champagne or fanfare. I didn't need to. Standing in the music room, watching Eliza play the cello, her instrument, her choice, her triumph, that was celebration enough. A week later, we held a small recital for friends and family who had supported us through the ordeal. Eliza performed a piece she had composed herself, dedicated to the strength we carry when others try to take everything. It was haunting, beautiful, and perfect. Every note carried the story of betrayal, anger, resilience, and ultimate justice. Every listener felt it, not just the music, but the raw, unfiltered journey of a young girl whose life had been threatened and reclaimed. And in that moment, I realized something fundamental: hate, resentment, and betrayal are heavy burdens. But if you channel them carefully, strategically, they can become tools of survival and transformation. We had survived. We had reclaimed what was ours. And most importantly, Eliza had grown into someone no one could ever manipulate, steal from, or break again. Even after the legal victory, the echoes of my parents' betrayal lingered. It wasn't just about the money or the cello anymore. It was about trust, about boundaries, about recognizing the damage inflicted over decades. They had tried to strip us of dignity, of security, of peace, and they had failed. Yet their shadow still haunted the edges of our lives. I realized I needed a strategy, not just for defense, but for total emotional liberation. Therapy became part of our daily rhythm, Eliza, me, and even a few sessions focused on unpacking the toxic patterns my parents had woven. I wanted Eliza to understand the difference between hatred and justice. Hate can consume you, but justice, true, calculated, righteous justice, can empower you. One evening, while reviewing our financial documents for the final audit, I found something astonishing. A ledger my parents had kept secretly, recording every time they'd manipulated friends, family, or acquaintances for gain. It wasn't legally incriminating, not yet, but it was a map, a blueprint of their methods, their logic, their patterns. I stared at it, a dark thrill running through me. For the first time, I saw their actions not just as personal attacks, but as a predictable system that could be anticipated, countered, and exposed. Knowledge, I realized, was more powerful than rage. Rage alone had fueled our fight until now. Knowledge would guarantee our victory never wavered. Eliza and I began planning a larger strategy, not for revenge in the childish sense, but for accountability. Public exposure, evidence-based confrontation, and the dismantling of their influence in circles they thought untouchable. Every move had to be precise, surgical, every public interaction calculated. We started small, conversations with mutual contacts, clarifying facts, providing evidence where necessary. Slowly, the truth spread. Friends and acquaintances who had once trusted my parents now began questioning them. Their reputation, built on manipulation and deceit, started to crumble. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. At a community event, my parents approached me, masked with false smiles, attempting the same guilt and manipulation tactics they had always used. But I was ready. Calm, composed, and armed with facts, I confronted them in front of everyone. "You stole from us," I said, my voice steady, echoing across the small hall. "You betrayed your own family. Every action, every lie, every manipulation is documented, and now everyone can see it. The cello, the money, the trust you thought you had, it's gone, and this time it's permanent." Their faces drained of color. They sputtered, tried to interject, but the crowd had already sensed the truth. Whispers spread like wildfire, questions directed at them, doubts amplified. They had underestimated how far we had come, how prepared we were to expose everything. Afterward, as we left the event, Eliza gripped my hand tightly. "That was amazing," she said. "I didn't think we could ever make them stop." "They never stopped," I reminded her gently. "We just learned how to make sure their power ends here." Her eyes sparkled, a mixture of relief, pride, and a quiet understanding of justice. I realized that this was the real victory, not just reclaiming what was taken, but reclaiming our sense of security, our sense of dignity, and the narrative of our own lives. In the weeks that followed, my parents retreated into silence, their influence further diminished, their threats reduced to whispers. For the first time in my life, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with material victory. It was the weight of liberation, the freedom from fear, from manipulation, from abuse. And as Eliza practiced her cello, composing pieces filled with raw emotion and subtle defiance, I understood we had transformed our pain into something enduring, beautiful, and untouchable. Hate had been our catalyst, but justice, strategic, uncompromising, righteous justice, was our legacy. The months after our public confrontation became a study in quiet reclamation. Life wasn't perfect, and the scars my parents left weren't going to vanish overnight, but they had lost their grip. Their ability to manipulate, intimidate, or control was gone. Every phone call ignored, every attempt at contact deflected was a small victory, a boundary firmly drawn. Eliza thrived in ways I had only dreamed of. She poured herself into her cello, creating music that carried the intensity of every betrayal she'd witnessed. Each note, each phrase, became a declaration. No one could take her light again. Watching her, I realized this was the true restitution, the restoration of our emotional world, the security that no amount of stolen money could provide. I also rebuilt my life's foundation around transparency and accountability. Friends and family who had once been wary now rallied around us, drawn not just to our story but to the integrity with which we had pursued justice. Legal victories aside, it was the moral high ground that solidified our standing. Every document, every public statement, every small, deliberate action reinforced a clear truth. Our lives were ours to define. And yet the shadow of the past remained, not as a torment but as a caution. I knew my parents' betrayal could have gone differently if we hadn't acted decisively. That awareness became a lesson for Eliza. Vigilance, self-respect, and the courage to confront injustice head-on were weapons no one could steal. I returned to the cello room one evening, alone, watching Eliza rehearse a piece she'd composed herself. The melody was fierce and tender, filled with defiance and sorrow intertwined. It struck me, the cello had never just been an instrument, it was a symbol, a vessel carrying the weight of our struggle and the triumph of our resilience. "I never want to feel powerless again," I whispered to her, though she was focused on her music, "and I promise you never will." Her eyes met mine, glowing with understanding. "We're free now," she said softly, "completely free." The aftermath was more than legal restitution. My parents' actions had triggered a cascade of reflection, empowerment, and clarity in our lives. The $87,000 they stole didn't matter in the end. It was the justice, the exposure, the reclaiming of our narrative that held power. Material loss can be replaced. Trust, dignity, and control over one's life are irreplaceable, and we had them back. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit with a journal and write down every instance of deceit, every manipulation, every moment of anger and fear we had endured. But I no longer wrote out of rage. I wrote to remember that we had survived, that we had triumphed, that justice had been meted, and that hate, when channeled strategically, could serve as a guide toward truth. And in the final reflection, I realized, life isn't just about surviving betrayal. It's about transforming it into a testament of strength, a story that teaches resilience, patience, and calculated justice. My daughter's cello, reclaimed in spirit if not in its stolen form, sang louder than ever, not because of money, not because of vengeance, but because we had endured, we had fought, and we had won in the ways that mattered most. The past would always be a shadow, but it no longer had the power to define us. The cello played on, our hearts healed, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly unbroken. End of story, 6,000-word narrative complete, fully structured for YouTube long-form storytelling in hate-driven family drama justice style. If you want, I can also create the full YouTube-optimized script version, formatted with narration cues, mini cliffhangers, and pacing instructions for direct voiceover use. This makes it plug-and-play ready for your channel. Do you want me to do that next?